The first sign something was wrong came before anyone spoke. The conference room was still empty, lights humming softly above the long glass table, when Ethan Reynolds walked in and took the chair at the head. Not the one closest to the screen. Not the one nearest the door. The head. The seat that implied authority without saying it out loud. I paused in the doorway, laptop pressed to my chest, and watched him adjust his cufflinks like the room already belonged to him. On paper, we had the same position. Same title. Same level of responsibility. Same salary band, same reporting line. Our offices were side by side, separated by a thin wall that did nothing to block sound. I could hear his phone calls. He could hear the late nights when my keyboard didn't stop. But Ethan never saw me as an equal. His last name carried weight in this company. Everyone knew it. Reynolds Industries wasn't just the name on the building. It was his family. His father, Richard Reynolds, had built the company from a logistics startup into a multinational operation with contracts spanning 3 continents. People lowered their voices when Richard passed. They straightened their backs. They smiled wider. Ethan inherited that gravity without earning it. I inherited spreadsheets, risk assessments, forecasts that actually held when pressure was applied. My name carried results. Quiet ones. The kind that didn't make for stories at company dinners. Still, Ethan spoke to me like I worked for him. "Make sure this is ready by noon," he'd say, standing in my doorway without knocking. "Loop me in on your findings before you send anything," he'd add, already turning away. And everyone noticed. They noticed the way he interrupted me mid-sentence in meetings, raising a finger as if pausing a child. They noticed how he rephrased my ideas 5 minutes later and waited for praise. They noticed how he smiled, that calm, condescending smile that suggested patience, as if he were tolerating my presence rather than relying on my work. No one said anything, because no one wanted to be the person who challenged a Reynolds. I learned early on that fighting him directly would be pointless, not because I couldn't win, but because I wouldn't be allowed to. Power doesn't argue, it assumes. So I did what I've always done best. I watched. I listened. I waited. The irony was that Ethan and I had started on the same day. Orientation, identical folders, identical welcome emails. He'd shaken my hand then, firm and confident, already certain of his place. "Guess we'll be working closely," he'd said, glancing briefly at my name badge before looking past me. I remember thinking that proximity didn't mean partnership. Over time, the distance between us became clearer. Ethan loved visibility, presentations, big picture statements, meetings that ended with no conclusions but plenty of applause. I loved structure. I loved understanding where every number came from and where it would collapse if pushed too hard. I loved catching problems before they became disasters. That difference mattered more than either of us realized, especially when stakes were low. But stakes have a way of changing. That morning, as I took my seat, not at the head of the table, but beside it, I felt the familiar tension settle in my chest. Ethan didn't look at me. He didn't need to. His confidence filled the room ahead of everyone else. "Let's keep this efficient today," he said, tapping his pen against the table. "I'll lead." Of course you will, I thought. I opened my laptop anyway, because while Ethan believed authority was something you inherited, I knew better. Authority is fragile. It survives only as long as reality allows it to. And reality, sooner or later, always asks for proof. I didn't know yet that within days, a $30 million client would walk through those doors, that the company's biggest deal of the year would rest on a single meeting, that Ethan's confidence would finally meet a question it couldn't answer. But even then, watching him claim space that wasn't his, I felt it. That quiet certainty I've learned to trust. This wouldn't last forever. And when it broke, it wouldn't be loud at first. It would start with silence, the kind that makes everyone look at the wrong person, and then, slowly, at the right one. If arrogance had a sound, it would be Ethan's voice when he said my name. Not sharp, not aggressive, soft, almost friendly, as if he were doing me a favor by acknowledging my existence at all. Meetings became his stage. He'd arrive early, spread his notebook open wide, laptop angled so the screen faced everyone else. He liked to look prepared. He liked the illusion of control even more. I learned the pattern quickly. I'd begin outlining a concern. Cash flow timing, client compliance risk, a clause buried too deep for comfort. And he'd interrupt before I reached the second sentence. Right, right, he'd say, nodding. What she means is. And then he'd say something adjacent. Not wrong enough to challenge. Not right enough to matter. People nodded anyway. Once I corrected him. Just once. We can't guarantee that margin without renegotiating logistics, I said calmly. The current model doesn't. He smiled. Not amused, not angry, patient. The way someone smiles at a trainee who doesn't yet understand how things work. I've got it, he said. You're thinking too narrowly. Too narrowly. As if numbers had feelings. As if contracts bent out of respect. After that, he started assigning me tasks publicly. Can you pull the background data? Can you summarize the risks for later? Just send me your notes. I'll decide what to include. I wasn't his assistant. Everyone in the room knew that. Still, no one corrected him, because correcting Ethan meant correcting Richard Reynolds by extension. And no one wanted that kind of attention. My inbox filled with forwarded emails from Ethan that added nothing but his signature at the bottom. My work, reframed as his oversight. My analyses reduced to attachments he never read fully. Late one evening, as the office lights dimmed automatically around us, he leaned against my doorway and watched me type. You work too much, he said lightly. You know that, right? I didn't look up. Deadlines don't care about balance. He laughed. That's why I handle the bigger picture. There it was again. The smile. Condescending. Effortless. Untouchable. He believed hierarchy existed even when it didn't. Believed that proximity to power made him powerful. Believed that silence meant agreement. What he didn't realize was that silence can also mean calculation. I started documenting everything. Every ignored warning. Every corrected number. Every assumption he made without checking. I kept versions of files with timestamps, tracked edits, saved emails he never replied to. Not out of spite. Out of habit. Because experience had taught me something Ethan never learned. Confidence without understanding is a liability waiting for the right moment. And moments always come. The office culture adapted to him. People laughed when he spoke. They waited for his approval before speaking up. Even the CEO, Michael Carter, treated Ethan with careful neutrality, respectful, but distant. Michael wasn't blind, just cautious. Richard Reynolds, on the other hand, rarely intervened at all. When he did appear, the room changed instantly. His presence didn't demand attention. It commanded it. He watched more than he spoke, listened more than he praised. Ethan always straightened when his father entered. His voice grew louder, his certainty sharper. I stayed the same, because I didn't need to be noticed yet. The more Ethan interrupted me, the more he revealed himself. He skimmed instead of reading, reacted instead of anticipating. He liked answers, hated questions. And complex clients don't ask easy questions. The night before the client announcement, I overheard Ethan on the phone, pacing his office. This one's mine, he said confidently. It's straightforward. I closed my laptop slowly. Nothing worth $30 million is ever straightforward. I didn't correct him. I didn't warn him again. I just waited. because the smile he wore so easily, the one that dismissed, diminished, and underestimated, would soon meet something it couldn't control. And when that happened, no one would need me to say a word. They'd hear the silence instead. The announcement came on a Tuesday morning, slipped casually into the weekly leadership briefing as if it weren't about to tilt the entire floor on its axis. "We're onboarding a new client," Michael Carter said, hands folded, voice even. "Projected value, 30 million over the next 18 months. The room changed temperature, chairs shifted, pens froze midair. Someone let out a quiet breath they didn't realize they were holding. 30 million wasn't just a contract. It was visibility, leverage, headlines. It was the kind of number that decided promotions, budgets, and who suddenly mattered a lot more than they had the week before. I felt it too. But what I felt wasn't excitement. It was tension. Before Michael could continue, Ethan leaned forward, already smiling, already certain. "I've reviewed their profile," he said smoothly. "Their growth trajectory aligns perfectly with our current expansion strategy. I'd be happy to take point." Happy. As if this were a favor he was offering the company. Michael hesitated, just a fraction of a second. Barely noticeable. But I saw it. He glanced briefly in my direction, then back at Ethan. "That makes sense," he said carefully. "You'll lead the account." Ethan's smile widened. "And I'll want her involved for support," he added, gesturing vaguely toward me without looking. "She knows the data." Support. Not co-lead. Not strategic partner. Support. Richard Reynolds sat at the far end of the table, hands resting calmly on the polished surface. He didn't speak, didn't nod, didn't object. His eyes lingered on Ethan for a moment longer than necessary. Not with pride, exactly, but expectation, the kind that comes with inheritance. I nodded once. Neutral, professional. Inside, something clicked into place. After the meeting, the office buzzed like a live wire. People stopped pretending to work. Conversations bloomed in corners. 30 million had a way of doing that. Ethan walked out like he'd already won. "We'll need a deck by Friday," he said over his shoulder. "High level. Don't get lost in details." I followed him into his office and closed the door behind us. "This client isn't high level," I said evenly. "Their contracts are aggressive. Their compliance history." He waved a hand, dismissive. "Every big client is aggressive. That's why they're big." "That's not what I mean," I replied. "Their last 2 vendors pulled out early. There were penalties." "Which we won't have," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Because we're not them." Confidence again. Unexamined. Untested. I studied his face, the ease with which he assumed outcomes bent toward him. For the first time, I wondered if he truly believed this was his deal already, or if he simply didn't know how to imagine failure. "I'll send you my findings," I said finally. "Great," he replied, already opening another email. "I'll skim them." He didn't hear the warning in that sentence. By Wednesday afternoon, I had gone through every line of the client's preliminary documents. Their revenue projections were optimistic. Their timelines conflicted with regulatory windows in 2 regions. Their expectations around customization exceeded what our current infrastructure could deliver without reallocating resources. Resources Ethan had already promised elsewhere. I sent a detailed summary. Clear. Direct. Flagged risks in red. No response. Thursday morning, I sent a follow-up. Shorter this time, more pointed. Nothing. That afternoon, I passed Ethan in the hallway, laughing with someone from marketing. "Did you see my notes?" I asked when the others drifted away. Yeah, he said, waving his phone. "You always see ghosts. It's fine." Ghosts. I went back to my office and stared at the wall between us, thin, white, deceptive. On the other side, I could hear him on another call, already using phrases like guaranteed scalability and seamless integration. Words that sounded good. Words that meant nothing without substance. That evening, Michael sent a calendar invite. Client meeting. Friday, 9 a.m. Attendees. Executive team, legal, client representatives. Richard Reynolds was included. So was I. Added last. Support, I reminded myself. I stayed late that night, not because I was asked to, but because I needed to know exactly where the cracks were before someone stepped on them. I ran alternative models, drafted contingency terms, prepared answers to questions no one had asked yet. Around 10, Ethan knocked once and stepped into my office without waiting. "You still here?" he said, surprised. "Preparing," I replied. He smiled again, softer this time, almost kind. "Relax. This is a big win. Don't overthink it." I closed my laptop slowly. Some people mistake calm for ignorance. Others mistake silence for obedience. I knew better. As Ethan walked away, already convinced tomorrow would crown him, I saved one last file and labeled it simply, clarifications. Because when $30 million is on the table, clarity becomes everything. And tomorrow, clarity would have its moment. The night before the meeting, the office felt like a ship pretending it wasn't heading into rough water. Most floors were dark by 7. Security lights cast long reflections across glass walls, turning every office into a quiet aquarium. From my chair, I could see Ethan through the partition, jacket off, sleeves rolled up, phone pressed to his ear. He looked relaxed. Too relaxed. I reopened the client's draft agreement for the 4th time. The risks weren't subtle anymore. They were screaming. Delivery timelines that ignored regional approval processes, penalty clauses triggered by factors outside our control, performance guarantees written broadly enough to be interpreted however the client pleased. On paper, it looked ambitious. In reality, it was a trap disguised as confidence. I built a side-by-side comparison, what Ethan planned to promise versus what we could actually deliver. The gap between the two made my jaw tighten. At 8:43 p.m., I sent him one last email. No emotion, no commentary, just facts. 3 bullet points, 2 highlighted clauses, 1 alternative structure that reduced exposure without killing the deal. I stared at the screen until the email status changed from sending to sent. 10 minutes passed, then 20. At 9:12, my phone buzzed. "Ethan." "Still working?" he asked, sounding amused. "Yes." "You really don't need to do all this," he said. "The client likes confidence. Overanalysis kills momentum." "This isn't overanalysis," I replied. "It's risk." He sighed, the sound of someone indulging a habit they find mildly annoying. "You're overcomplicating it," he said again. "Trust me." There it was. Not the numbers, not the data. Trust me. I closed my eyes briefly. "Have you read the penalty section?" I asked. "Skimmed," he said without hesitation. "Standard stuff." It wasn't. "If they invoke Clause 14 under current terms, we absorb the full cost," I said. "That's—" "We won't miss the timeline," he cut in. "Problem solved." "You're assuming approvals won't stall." "They won't." "You're assuming internal resources will be reassigned." "They will be." "You're assuming—" "I'm assuming we know how to run our own company," he snapped, the first edge creeping into his voice. "Look, I appreciate your diligence. I really do. But tomorrow, I need you aligned. Not complicating things. Aligned. As if alignment meant silence. "I'll be there," I said calmly. "Good," he replied, already disengaging. "Get some rest." The call ended. I sat back and listened to the hum of the building. Somewhere down the hall, a cleaning cart rattled. The world kept moving, indifferent to the numbers glowing on my screen. I thought about Michael Carter. How carefully he chose his words. how often he watched instead of spoke. I thought about Richard Reynolds, whose silence carried more weight than most people's speeches. And I thought about Ethan, raised inside this company like a second skin, never needing to prove he belonged. Preparation, I knew, wasn't just about information, it was about readiness. So I prepared for everything. I printed 2 versions of the proposal, Ethan's original and my revised structure. I highlighted inconsistencies, flagged legal exposure, and mapped out answers to the questions a competent client would ask, not the ones Ethan hoped they'd ask. By the time I shut down my computer, it was after 11. As I reached for my coat, Ethan's office door opened. He looked surprised to see me still there. "You're really committed to this," he said, half smiling. "I'm committed to the company," I replied. He studied me for a moment, then shrugged. "Tomorrow will go fine." I nodded, because correcting him now would change nothing. As I walked out into the empty elevator, I felt an odd calm settle over me, the kind that comes when you've done everything you can, and the rest is no longer in your hands. Some people prepare to impress, others prepare to survive, and a few prepare to be undeniable. Tomorrow would decide which one of us truly was. The conference room was already full when I arrived, not crowded, arranged. Chairs aligned precisely, glasses of water untouched, legal pads placed at identical angles like someone had measured them. The client's team sat together on one side of the table, quiet, observant. 2 attorneys, 1 woman from operations, 1 man whose job was clearly to say very little and remember everything. Michael Carter stood near the window, reviewing something on his tablet. He looked up when he saw me and nodded once. No smile, no reassurance, just acknowledgement. Richard Reynolds arrived last. The room shifted the moment he entered. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. People straightened instinctively, as if gravity had increased by a fraction. Richard didn't rush. He never rushed. He took his seat without ceremony and folded his hands, eyes already scanning faces. Ethan stood, confident, relaxed, perfectly timed. "Good morning, everyone," he said, voice steady, practiced. "We're excited about the opportunity to work together." He clicked the remote, and the first slide lit up the screen behind him. Clean, polished, optimistic. I watched the client instead of the presentation. They listened politely. Too politely. The first 10 minutes went exactly as Ethan had predicted. High-level overview, market alignment, growth language that sounded impressive and said nothing concrete. He spoke well. I'd give him that. He had a way of making uncertainty sound intentional. Then the questions started. Not aggressive, just precise. "How are you accounting for regional compliance delays?" one of the attorneys asked. Ethan answered smoothly. "We've built flexibility into the timeline." I glanced at the slide. There was no such flexibility. "And the penalty clauses?" The other attorney followed. "Under what conditions do they trigger?" Ethan smiled. "We don't anticipate triggering them." That wasn't an answer. The operations lead leaned forward slightly. "That's not what I asked." A pause. Short, but noticeable. Ethan recovered quickly, pulling up another slide. "Our historical performance shows—" "Your historical performance isn't the concern," she said calmly. "Your future guarantees are." I felt the air tighten. Michael shifted his weight. Richard remained still. Ethan's voice stayed confident, but something had changed beneath it. A slight acceleration, a need to fill space before it grew uncomfortable. He referenced projections, spoke about internal efficiencies, gestured toward numbers that looked solid until you examined their assumptions. The client did examine them. "Can you walk us through this margin under a delayed approval scenario?" the quiet man asked. Ethan hesitated. "Just long enough. We've modeled for typical delays," he said. They won't materially affect. Define typical, the man said gently. Silence stretched. Not dramatic, just heavy. I watched Ethan glance at the screen, then at Michael, as if confirmation might appear there. It didn't. Michael's expression was neutral, but his eyes had narrowed slightly, the way they did when he sensed a problem forming. Ethan cleared his throat. We're confident in our delivery capabilities. The operations lead exchanged a look with one of the attorneys. It was quick, professional, but I saw it. Doubt. Ethan pushed forward anyway. He talked faster now, stacking assurances on top of each other. He promised a timeline that hadn't been approved internally. He referenced resources that hadn't been allocated. He spoke as if certainty alone could make the gaps disappear. And then he crossed the line. We can commit to full customization within the first quarter, he said. I felt my fingers curl against my notebook. That wasn't just optimistic. It was impossible. The operations lead looked directly at him. You're certain about these terms? Ethan nodded. Too quickly. Yes. Another pause. This one longer. Michael turned his head toward Ethan slowly. That's not what we discussed. The room went very quiet. Richard Reynolds lifted his gaze from the table for the first time and looked at his son. Not sharply, not angrily, just directly. The kind of look that strips away pretense. Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it. The client's attorney broke the silence. We need clarity before we proceed. I felt something settle inside me. Not satisfaction, not relief. Just readiness. This was the moment where the meeting could collapse completely. Where trust could fracture beyond repair. I hadn't spoken yet. I wasn't supposed to. But the numbers were already unraveling, and everyone in the room could feel it. The confidence Ethan relied on had finally met resistance it couldn't charm its way through. Michael glanced in my direction. Just once. Not an invitation. Not a command. A question. And in that instant, I understood something clearly. Preparation isn't loud. It waits. It listens. And when the noise falls away, it steps forward without asking permission. I straightened slightly in my chair. The meeting had begun as Ethan's, but it was no longer his to control. Ethan tried to regain control the way he always did, by talking. He adjusted his stance, squared his shoulders, and smiled again, that familiar expression meant to reassure, to signal mastery. But this time, the smile didn't land. It hovered awkwardly, unsupported by anything solid beneath it. Let me clarify, he said quickly. What I meant was... The client's attorney raised a hand, not sharply, politely. Before we go further, she said, we need to understand whether the commitments you've outlined are formally approved by your internal teams. Ethan's eyes flicked to Michael. Michael didn't answer. That level of customization, the operations lead continued, requires significant resource reallocation. Are those resources currently available? Another pause. Ethan inhaled, visibly buying time. We're flexible, he said. We adapt quickly. That's not an answer, she replied. The quiet man finally spoke again. His voice was calm, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. You've presented this as a certainty, he said. Certainty implies risk transfer. If you're wrong, who absorbs the cost? Ethan opened his mouth, closed it. The silence that followed wasn't dramatic. No raised voices, no confrontation. Just the absence of sound where confidence was supposed to be. I could feel eyes shifting, subtle movements, someone leaning back, someone folding their hands tighter. These weren't reactions to failure yet. They were reactions to instability. Michael cleared his throat. Ethan, he said carefully, can you confirm the timeline you just referenced? Ethan swallowed. It's an estimate. The word landed badly. Richard Reynolds didn't move, but something in his expression changed. Not disappointment. Evaluation. The way a builder looks at a structure and realizes one support beam was never installed. The client's attorney exchanged a glance with her colleague. "So to be clear," she said, "the penalties outlined here," she tapped the printed contract, "would apply even if the delay comes from regulatory approval outside your control?" Ethan hesitated. "Yes," he said finally. "It was the wrong answer. I saw it instantly. So did they." "That's concerning," the operations lead said, "especially given your expansion claims." Ethan rushed in again. "Those penalties are unlikely to be enforced." "Why?" the attorney asked. "Because we have a strong relationship model," he said. "We prioritize partnerships." The quiet man tilted his head slightly. "That doesn't mitigate legal exposure." Michael shifted in his chair now. "Ethan," he said, more firmly, "this isn't aligning with what was reviewed internally." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I thought we agreed this was acceptable risk," he said, a note of defensiveness creeping in. Michael didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was controlled, but unmistakably cool. "We agreed to explore options," he said, "not to guarantee outcomes we can't support." The room felt smaller suddenly. Ethan glanced toward his father, searching for something. Support. Rescue. Confirmation that this would be smoothed over like everything else. Richard Reynolds met his gaze, and didn't step in. That was when it truly began to unravel. The client leaned back, hands folded. "I'm concerned," the operations lead said plainly. "We need transparency. Right now, we're hearing confidence without structure." Confidence without structure. I saw Ethan's fingers tighten around the remote. He clicked to the next slide too quickly, skipping one entirely. "This projection assumes full rollout by Q2, the attorney said, pointing. "Based on what you've just said, that assumption isn't valid." Ethan's voice rose slightly. "It's a best-case scenario." "But you presented it as a base case?" she replied. Another silence, longer this time. Michael exhaled slowly. He looked at the client, then back at Ethan. "We may need to pause," he said. "Reassess certain—" "No," Ethan said too fast. "We don't need to pause." The word echoed in the room. Richard Reynolds finally spoke. "Ethan," he said quietly. Just his name. Ethan froze. Richard didn't raise his voice. He didn't criticize. He simply asked, "Are you certain about the terms you've just committed to?" The question was devastating in its simplicity. Ethan looked at the contract, at the screen, at the people around the table. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked unsure. He began. He stopped. The client waited. So did everyone else. That hesitation, that brief, unguarded moment, told them everything. Michael turned his head slightly and looked at me. Not as support, not as backup, as an option. I felt the shift then. Not dramatic, not loud, but unmistakable. Authority doesn't always announce itself when it moves. Sometimes it simply relocates. The client's attorney followed Michael's gaze. Then the operations lead did the same. Ethan noticed. He stepped back half a pace without realizing it. The breakdown wasn't explosive. There was no argument, no raised voices, no accusations. Just a slow, undeniable collapse of credibility. Confidence had carried Ethan this far. But now the room wanted answers. And answers require something confidence alone can't provide. They require understanding. I placed my notebook flat on the table and rested my hands on it. I didn't speak yet, but I knew I was about to. I didn't plan the moment. That's what people always assume later. That I had rehearsed some dramatic intervention, timed my entrance like a performance. The truth is simpler and less flattering. I spoke because the silence had become dangerous. Allow me to clarify, I said. My voice didn't cut through the room. It didn't need to. It simply occupied the space that Ethan's confidence had just vacated. Every head turned toward me. Ethan looked startled, as if I'd broken an unspoken rule. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. For once, he didn't interrupt. I stood, not because standing was powerful, but because it made the screen visible behind me. What you're hearing, I continued calmly, are best-case assumptions presented as baseline guarantees. That's where the confusion is coming from. I clicked back to the slide Ethan had skipped. The projected Q2 rollout, I said, pointing, is only achievable under two conditions: expedited regulatory approval and full internal resource reassignment. Neither of those has been formally approved yet. The client's attorney leaned forward. So this timeline isn't guaranteed? No, I said plainly. It's conditional. The word seemed to relax the room. I moved on, methodically, almost clinically. No grand gestures, no commentary on Ethan's mistakes, just structure. Clause 14, I said, flipping to the contract copy I'd printed, is the highest risk section. Under its current wording, penalties apply even when delays occur outside our operational control. That's not sustainable for either side. The operations lead nodded slowly. That aligns with our concern. I felt Ethan watching me now, rigid, silent. I didn't look at him. There's an alternative, I said. We shift the penalties to performance-based milestones rather than fixed dates. That protects your delivery expectations while accounting for regulatory variance. I paused. This also incentivizes us properly, I added. If we miss due to internal failure, penalties apply. If delays are external, they don't. The quiet man spoke again. That's reasonable. Michael's posture had changed. He wasn't tense anymore. He was attentive. I continued, addressing questions before they were asked. Customization within the first quarter, I said, is not feasible without compromising quality. However, a phased deployment achieves the same outcome within 6 months, with measurable checkpoints. I pulled up the contingency model I'd prepared. Numbers replaced promises. Assumptions were labeled as assumptions. Risks were acknowledged instead of buried. For the first time since the meeting began, the client started asking me questions. What happens if approval is delayed by 90 days? How flexible is the resource pool? What internal safeguards do you have? I answered each one without rushing. Ethan had fully disappeared from the conversation now. He stood near the screen, hands at his sides, listening to his own deal being rebuilt without him. At one point, he tried to interject. But that wasn't the original. Michael raised a hand slightly. Let her finish, he said. That single sentence carried more authority than any title. The shift was complete. The client's attorney scribbled notes rapidly. The operations lead asked follow-ups, not to challenge, but to refine. The quiet man finally smiled, just a little. This feels transparent, he said. That's important to us. I nodded. It should be. At this scale, surprises are expensive. No one disagreed. I was acutely aware of Richard Reynolds then. I didn't look at him, but I felt his attention, steady, assessing, unblinking, not offended, not defensive, interested. When I finished, the room was quiet again, but this silence was different. It wasn't uncertainty. It was alignment. The operations lead closed her notebook. This framework makes sense, she said. We'd need to revise some language, but it's workable. The attorney nodded. Agreed. Michael exhaled softly, relief flickering across his face for just a second before he masked it. Ethan remained silent. For the first time since I'd known him, he didn't know where to stand. The authority he wore so comfortably had slipped off, and he hadn't noticed until it was gone. I sat back down. No one applauded. No one needed to. Because in rooms like this, respect doesn't announce itself loudly. It shows up in who people listen to next. And from that moment on, they weren't listening to him anymore. The meeting didn't end with a signature. That surprised some people later, when they heard the story retold in fragments, simplified into a neat victory. But real turning points rarely come with applause or ink drying on paper. They come with something quieter. Agreement. The operations lead leaned back in her chair, fingers resting lightly on the table. This version, she said, tapping the revised framework on her tablet, addresses our core concerns. Her attorney nodded. Provided the language is adjusted to reflect conditional timelines, we're comfortable proceeding. Proceeding. Not walking away, not pausing indefinitely, not escalating to another vendor. Proceeding. Michael smiled then, not broadly, not triumphantly, but with visible relief. We can have legal incorporate these revisions by end of day, he said, and circulate a clean draft tomorrow. That works for us, the attorney replied. The quiet man closed his notebook. This conversation changed the tone, he said calmly. We appreciate transparency. I inclined my head slightly. So do we. No one looked at Ethan. Not intentionally, not cruelly. They simply didn't need to. He stood off to the side now, hands clasped too tightly, gaze fixed somewhere just beyond the table. The confidence that had carried him into the room hadn't followed him out of the conversation. It had evaporated, leaving behind something awkward and exposed. Michael glanced at Richard Reynolds. It was subtle, but meaningful. Richard didn't nod. He didn't smile. He didn't offer commentary or validation. He simply met Michael's look, a silent exchange between two men who understood what had just happened. The meeting concluded shortly after. Chairs moved, laptops closed, handshakes were exchanged, polite, professional, unremarkable. When the client team left the room, there was no celebration, just a collective exhale. The door closed behind them. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Michael turned to me. Thank you, he said, clearly, in front of everyone. That intervention saved this deal. Saved. The word landed heavier than praise. I nodded once. It was fixable. Richard Reynolds looked at me then. Really looked. Not with warmth. Not with approval. With something sharper and far more valuable. Recognition. He didn't say my name. He didn't have to. Let's move forward carefully, he said to the room. 30 million reasons to do it right. That was all. Ethan finally moved. I should have been looped in on those revisions, he said, attempting a tone of calm professionalism. Michael's response was immediate. You were. Silence. The information was available, Michael continued evenly. What mattered today was who understood it. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He couldn't. Arguments require footing, and he had none left. People began filing out. Legal discussed next steps. Someone mentioned timelines. The machinery of the company restarted, now realigned. As I gathered my notes, I became aware of Ethan standing beside me. That wasn't your call, he said quietly. I met his gaze for the first time since the meeting began. No, I replied. It was the company's. He searched my face for something. Guilt, hesitation, apology. He found none. I walked past him without another word. In the hallway, the usual noise returned. Phones ringing, footsteps, muted conversations. To anyone watching from the outside, nothing extraordinary had happened. But something fundamental had shifted. The deal wasn't signed yet, but it was no longer at risk. And more importantly, the question of who actually ran processes inside this company had been answered, not by titles, not by last names, but by competence under pressure. That answer would echo far beyond this meeting. Because once authority reveals itself, it doesn't need to announce its return. It simply stays where it belongs. The hallway felt longer than usual. People moved around me with purpose, conversations resuming as if the last 2 hours hadn't quietly rearranged the internal gravity of the company. Someone laughed near the elevators. A printer whirred to life. Normalcy reasserted itself quickly. It always does. But underneath it, something had shifted. I was halfway to my office when Ethan called my name. Not loudly, not angrily, almost carefully. Wait. I stopped, turned slowly. For a moment, he didn't speak. He seemed to be choosing between several versions of himself. The confident one, the offended one, the entitled one. None of them fit the moment anymore. You blindsided me in there, he said finally. I kept my tone neutral. You were struggling. That wasn't your decision to make. No, I agreed. It was the client's. His eyes narrowed. You think you won? I considered the question. This isn't a competition, I said. It's a contract. He let out a short, humorless laugh. You don't just step in like that. I do, I replied. When silence becomes more dangerous than speaking. For a second, I thought he might argue. Instead, he looked past me, down the corridor as if checking whether anyone was watching. This company runs on relationships, he said quietly. You embarrassed me. I met his gaze steadily. You embarrassed yourself. That landed harder than anything else I could have said. He straightened, instinctively reclaiming posture. You're forgetting where you are. No, I said. I'm remembering. I turned and walked away. In my office, I closed the door and sat down without turning on the lights. The adrenaline faded slowly, leaving behind a familiar exhaustion, the kind that follows sustained focus rather than panic. I opened my laptop and began organizing files for legal. Revisions, notes, tracked changes. Work didn't pause just because a moment had passed. 20 minutes later, my phone rang. Michael Carter. Can you come by? He asked. Now. His office was quiet when I entered. The blinds were half drawn, muting the afternoon light. Michael gestured for me to sit. That was impressive, he said, without preamble. Necessary, I replied. He smiled faintly. That too. He leaned back, studying me openly now, not as a manager evaluating output, but as someone reassessing potential. You've been sending risk assessments to the main office for a while, he said. I didn't react. Yes. They're good, he continued. Very good. I know because I read them. A pause. I didn't know Ethan didn't. I chose my words carefully. He prefers summaries. Michael exhaled slowly. That preference nearly cost us $30 million. He folded his hands. I won't dance around this. I need people in this company who can think under pressure, not just present confidence. Today made something very clear. He slid a folder across the desk. Inside, a revised role outline, expanded authority, direct access to legal and compliance, final review power on high-value contracts, and a title change. This takes effect immediately, he said, pending formal board confirmation, but Richard has already agreed. Agreed. Of course he had. I want you leading risk and strategy on this account, Michael continued, and future ones like it. I closed the folder carefully. Understood. No victory speech? He asked lightly. I shook my head. There's work to do. He smiled then, genuinely this time. Exactly. As I stood to leave, he added, Ethan won't be managing you anymore. I assumed, I said. Michael's expression hardened slightly. He has a lot to learn. Yes, I agreed. He does. When I stepped back into the hallway, the building felt different. Not louder, not brighter, clearer. People looked up as I passed, not in awe, not in fear, just aware. By the time I reached my office, Ethan's door was closed. That too felt new. I sat down, opened my laptop, and began outlining next steps for the client. The deal wasn't finished yet. Not officially. But its survival had already changed more than a balance sheet. It had redrawn lines that had existed only by assumption. And assumptions, once challenged, rarely recover. Outside my window, the city moved on. Inside, the company quietly adjusted. And somewhere between those two truths, I understood something fully for the first time. Authority doesn't announce itself when it arrives. It simply becomes impossible to ignore. Ethan stopped giving me orders the next morning. It wasn't announced. There was no email, no meeting, no awkward acknowledgement. It simply didn't happen. His door stayed closed. His voice stayed contained. When we crossed paths in the hallway, he nodded, once, and kept walking. No smile, no condescension, no assumptions. The deal moved forward exactly the way it should have from the beginning. Legal incorporated the revised language. The client's team responded quickly, professionally, without suspicion. Questions were precise now, not probing. Collaborative instead of defensive. That was how I knew we'd truly saved it. $30 million doesn't forgive bravado, but it rewards clarity. Michael looped me into every update. Richard Reynolds was copied, always silently, never commenting, but always present. I learned to read his approval the way others read praise. Fewer words, sharper attention. 2 weeks later, the contract was signed. No champagne, no speeches, just signatures, timestamps, and the quiet finality of a deal done right. At the internal briefing, Michael presented the outcome. He thanked the teams involved. He highlighted process improvements, risk mitigation, and transparency. When he mentioned my name, it was without emphasis, as if my role had always been obvious. Ethan sat 2 seats away from me. He didn't look at me. Afterward, someone from finance stopped me by the coffee machine. "I didn't know you handled strategy," she said. "I always have," I replied. She smiled. "Guess some people are just louder." That was the thing Ethan never understood. Loudness feels like power until it meets resistance. Competence doesn't need volume. It holds its ground quietly and waits for reality to confirm it. Over the following months, things adjusted. People came to me directly now, not because of my title, though it helped, but because they trusted the answers they'd get. Ethan still attended meetings, still spoke, still smiled occasionally, but his interruptions were gone. His assumptions checked themselves before leaving his mouth. He learned restraint. Not humility. Not yet. But silence. And silence, for someone like him, was a lesson. One evening, long after the deal had faded into routine success, I stayed late again. Not out of necessity, out of habit. As I shut down my computer, I noticed a light still on across the hall. Ethan's office. For a moment, I considered knocking. Then I didn't. Some lessons aren't taught. They're absorbed. As I walked out of the building, the city lights reflected in the glass behind me. Reynolds Industries stood tall, unchanged on the outside. Inside, it was more honest now, more precise. I thought about last names, how they open doors, soften landings, create space before merit arrives. And I thought about processes. Processes don't care who your father is. They respond only to those who understand them. Ethan learned that in a room full of executives, lawyers, and a $30 million question he couldn't answer. I learned something too, that waiting isn't weakness. That silence, when chosen deliberately, is a strategy. And that when the moment comes, you don't need to raise your voice. You just need to be right. 30 million reasons to stay silent had taught us both that, and only one of us ever needed to learn it the hard way.